Hello and welcome to another episode of Whisky Walking. My name's George Fraser, and once again I'll be taking you through the exciting world of whisky. And for those of you who like a good walk, we'll be heading down to Duraden later on. Today we're in the kingdom of Fife, just behind me there. Now some of you have probably already clicked on to the fact that Fife does not feature on the radar of the whisky world. And you'd be probably right in thinking so, except for one small but significant detail. The quality of the barley grown down in the How of Fife there is one of the most well regarded in the world, and it is used in many of Scotland's finest single malts, to great acclaim. In tonight's episode, I'll be heading down to Duraden and Kenbach to talk to local biologist Dr. James Andrews. He believes he's found a very rare, and to what most people would believe to be extinct animal known as the Scottish wild bear. We'll be going there to test the validity of his claims. Then we shall be heading further up the coast to Montrose, where we shall be looking at the former Glenesk distillery. We will be meeting local legend Reverend Ron McCulloch, who remembers that distillery in its heyday, and can tell us everything we need to know about its glorious past. While myself, I shall be down in the How of Fife to start off with, where I shall be looking closer at that quality barley that will be used in many whisky making processes across the country. And I shall once again be taking a brief recap of that whisky making process and how that barley affects it for the better. Now comes the part of the episode that we dedicate to the discussion of the whisky making process and the key ingredients used in that process. We're having a brief recap for the benefit of those who've maybe come into this series a little later on and can't quite grasp what we're talking about yet. We are here in the picturesque heartlands of Fife by this beautiful stream as it cascades across the rocks, gathering minerals that will be key to the flavours of many whiskies. Waterways and streams have been used for hundreds and thousands of years in civilization, for drinking water, for agriculture, such as the powering of mills, and is now found its highest purpose in the production of whisky. And here is the second most important component of the whisky making process: barley. Now, as I said earlier, we are in the How of Fife, which is known around the world for producing a high quality barley grain. And as you can see, it's not quite ripe yet. There's a lot of green in there, but around about August-September time, it'll be ready to be imported by many of the world's finest single malts. Such malts include the classic lowland malt, Auchincillich. Also, Blair Gyle up in Speyside, which is a very sweet malt, uses a lot of this particular barley. However, none more so than the island distillery Bruchmore, which is its biggest importer. It has a very peaty character, but also utilises a lot of the qualities of the Fife barley in its particular flavour. Now, there is one more component of the whisky making process I haven't mentioned yet. Here we are by the Tay River, the longest river in Scotland, and one with one of the largest catchment areas of any river in the UK. And that serves well two single malts in Perthshire, the Aberfeldy and Edradour, very fine whiskies. Now, I'm here to talk about the third key ingredient in the whisky making process: yeast. I've just got a vat of it just here. Now, yeast is what I like to call the deal maker in the process, and I'm just going to recap that process right now. barley is soaked in water and then spread across the malting's floor and allowed to germinate, which it brings out the sugars. It is then put into the peat fire and smoked for a good number of hours to produce malt barley. Malt barley is then put into water along with yeast and allowed to ferment in the wash bags. This produces a very strong yet disgusting tasting beer known as wash. I used to get bedded on it when I used to work in a distillery a good number of years ago. Now, that wash is then put through a wash still and a spirit still, which are like large kettles, and that produces new make spirit. The new make spirit is then put into casks to mature. Generally, the ones we use are Spanish sherry and American bourbon, and they impart particular flavours onto the whiskey, along with the wood. Now, generally speaking, a standard bottling is matured for about 10 years, but if you want a really nice single malt, 15 to 18 is a good range, and that is whiskey making in a nutshell. This is the part of the episode that we dedicate to walking. Now, personally, I'd rather spend the whole episode talking about whiskey, but unfortunately we're not allowed to promote alcoholism, and we have to show a healthy lifestyle, as per BBC quotas or some nonsense like that. It's for this very reason that I'm here in Kemback today, which, as you can see, is a very picturesque village in the heartlands of Fife. I'm in the old kirk right now, which was built in 1582, until it was sadly burnt down by the Covenanters in 1637. While I'm here, I'm going to talk to a local expert called Dr. James Andrews. He believes that he has found the fabled Scottish wild bear. We're going to see if his story has any truth to it. Pleased to meet you, James.
And you too, George.
Call me Mr. Fraser.
Oh, okay.
Shall we take a seat? So, James, tell me a little bit about yourself.
Well, I was born in Hastings in 1974 and we moved to Edinburgh when I was 10 years old. Stayed there during my teenage years, and then I went to the University of St Andrews to study biology.
Now, let me stop you there, James. I believe we were having a wee chat before this pre-stage interview was filmed, and you were telling me you had plans to go to Oxford or Cambridge. Now, is that not true?
Well, yes, that is true. However, I decided I believed that St Andrews would give me the best opportunities because...
Because you were rejected by Oxford and Cambridge. Now, let me tell you something. My son, also known as George Fraser, he got into Oxford, and he was able to obtain a first-class honours degree.
Why are you doing this to me?
I'm a sceptical man, James. I have reason to believe that such a creature doesn't exist in the peaceful woodlands of Fife. Hence, if we discredit you a little bit, it'll be less disappointing for our viewers if we find nothing.
Well, I can prove to you that it does exist.
Well, why don't you tell us a wee bit about the creature then?
Well, I began studying the creature whilst I was at the University of St Andrews. If you go down to the library in Cooper over there, you will find plentiful material detailing stories, poetry, and various sightings of the Scottish wild bear from the 16 and 1700s.
Now, never let it be said that I'm not a man who enjoys a great story, and I respect local folklore. Back in the war, when I was known as Captain George Fraser, we were able to spin some great yarns in my unit. It was the only thing that stopped us from going mad down in those trenches.
I can imagine.
However, we cannot assume that the Scottish wild bear exists based on stories that are several hundred years old. You have to take these things with a pinch of salt. They're just stories.
Well, you may say that, but you're wrong, and I'll tell you why.
Okay.
If you go down to the Cults Hills or around this area, you'll realise there have been plenty of sightings of wild cats. And these aren't actually wild cat sightings. What people are actually seeing, and mistaken to be wild cats, is the Scottish wild bear.
Right. And I assume that these sightings are usually made in the dusk and twilight hours.
Well, yes, all the reports I've seen have been made during those time periods.
And presumably also that they're made by individual people as opposed to large groups of people.
Why are you doing this to me?
I'm merely suggesting that these sightings are never made in the daylight and never in front of a large group of witnesses. They always seem to be made by one individual person who can't see clearly due to the light, and assumes that something as insignificant as a dog is something more significant than it actually is. Now, I do not mean to be cynical, but you can't just assume that these things exist because you want them to.
Well, I can prove to you that they exist. We're going to take a walk in these woods, and I promise you by the end of the day, we will find a Scottish wild bear.
I'll bet my sporn we can't. Well, Andrews, we've been walking around for hours, and we still have yet to see any sighting of a Scottish wild bear.
Well, it's funny you should say that. Although we have been walking for hours and it has been a long journey, we are now in the area that the Scottish wild bear is known to roam. As you can see behind me, we have one of my old hunting dens. I don't use that particular one anymore. I prefer now to look for them slightly further on into the woods. I actually have with me many items that I use in order to track and study the bears. This is a tracking device. It's used to track tagged bears, ones that I've already found. Now, if you want to make friends with the bears so that they get to know you...
Friends with the bears?
Yes, they're actually very friendly once you get to know them. But the best way to do it is to obviously give them food. And these are bear treats.
Look like cat biscuits to me. Is that a cup?
Yes, indeed it is a cup. Now this is probably the most important item in the initial tracking period. As you may notice, there is a hole in the bottom of the cup. Now if you put this cup against a tree with the hole facing the bark, listen in, you're able to hear the sounds of the bears hunting and foraging around the woods. Once you've heard these sounds, you can identify the direction the sound is coming from, and it makes finding them a lot easier.
Unbelievable.
This is the perfect part of the woods to find a Scottish wild bear. Once we cross the stile behind us, we'll be in the dark part of the woods. And that is where they tend to live to avoid human contact. Guarantee you will find one once we cross.
So, James, do you believe in any of the other Scottish folklore creatures, such as the Loch Ness Monster?
Don't be silly. We both know the Loch Ness Monster is complete fiction. However, hiding in the depths of the water of Loch Ness, you'll find something else. The freshwater shark.
I wish I'd never asked.
Now, the freshwater shark, on occasion, has been known to...
Let's just stick with the bears, shall we, eh? I mean, one mythical creature's enough for one day, I think you'd agree.
Although I was up in Loch Ness last summer with my family, and whilst we were up there, we noticed that they bottle water straight from the loch and sell it on to tourists for an inflated price.
Nae surprising.
I guess it's not the kind of water you would want to put into your whiskey. Is it, George?
No.
Let's carry on, shall we?
Indeed.
We need to be quiet in here. Every time we've been to this part of the woods, I've always found one of the bears.
Look, enough is enough, James. Just give it up. Don't shh me.
No. Look over there.
I don't believe it. They actually exist.
Now, I've never seen her in this woods before, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to put a tag in her ear. What I need you to do is I need you to hold her still whilst I do so.
Hold her still?
I'm going to run in, I'm going to charge her, and I'll startle her whilst I put the tag in her ear. That will give you the perfect chance to hold her in place whilst I do that. So, on my count, I'm going to run in. 1, 2, 3, go.
Here we are in Montrose, and I'm going to meet a local legend and expert on the Glenesk distillery, Reverend Ron McCulloch.
Hello there, George. It's a pleasure to be on the show. It really is.
Please, Ron, call me Mr. Fraser.
Only if you call me Reverend McCulloch.
I'll consider it, Ron, but I don't normally compromise. Anyway, this is a lovely golf course you've brought us to. What's the connection?
Well, the clubhouse, there's some Glenesk for you to try later, and I play off 14.
Ah, I play off an 8. We'll have to get in a game of golf sometime.
Aye, I'll hold you to that. Golf is a fantastic game, and it really keeps the old bones fighting fit.
Always a good thing, Ron. Always a good thing. Now, as a fellow veteran and a man of the church, surely you must agree with me in saying that whiskey is the drink of God.
Actually, I'm an atheist.
Really? How can a reverend such as yourself not believe in God? Surely he will one day smite you with all his force for such sin.
Well, really, it's the family business. My father, he was a reverend, as was his father, and his father before him. Now, I used to believe, back when I was young, but the war, it changed so many things. So many things.
Now I can tell you quite a lot of things about the war, one of which being how we had to keep ourselves amused down in the trenches to stop us from going insane. Yet despite all that, me and the men I fought with never once lost our faith in God. Now, surely an atheist such as yourself is not fit to lead a congregation when you don't even believe in the most fundamental part of faith.
Well, any moron really can lead a congregation. For the most part, they're just sitting in the pews, bitching about their neighbours and their sinful deeds. However, they themselves have been spying on their neighbours with binoculars.
So your parishioners haven't been listening to your sermons. Surely that's a sign that you must be doing something wrong.
I don't believe so. Preachers in the past have taken the Bible far too seriously. Now let us consider history for a moment. If we go back to 1692 and 1693, there was a case of mass hysteria brought on by religious extremism. Now these were known as the Salem witch trials, in which many people needlessly lost their lives.
Now I don't normally compromise, but you've put to me a good argument there, Ron. However, consider this. Whiskey is made from only 3 ingredients: water, yeast, and barley. Yet it yields something so varied and always so inspired. How can something so simple yet so complex not be the work of an almighty creator?
Well, as you say, it's a complex drink, and almost mystical. Yet the simplicity of the ingredients make it so that man would have discovered it. No god would have made it that easy. However, without wanting to get too deep into this topic, shall we discuss the Glenesk?
Now you're only changing the subject because you know I'm right.
Now we're all entitled to our own opinions, Mr. Fraser.
Don't take what I'm telling you too seriously, Ron. I respect you and your views. Now, James Andrews, there's a man I wouldn't want to meet again.
Aye, you're telling me some riotous tales about what he used to get up to over in Fife. However, there's some Glenesk waiting for you over at the clubhouse. Shall we take a walk down?
Aye, I'm never one to turn down a dram.
Good to hear, good to hear.
Well, Ron, cheers.
Cheers.
That was an interesting whiskey, Ron. Although perhaps not quite as robust as something I would normally go for.
Now, as you know, it is my favourite whiskey. You should have had some fruity notes in there, with the undertones of dry grass and sandalwood. Now, what I like to do is I like to add the whiskey into where the holy water usually is, at the church. That way, I can take a dram during some of the more boring sermons, and it also helps me deal with some of the whinier members of the congregation.
Most of whom will be questioning you over your ropey beliefs, eh, Ron?
Well, say as you will, but...
I'm only ragging you, Ron. Now, could you tell us a wee bit more about the Glenesk distillery?
Certainly. Now, the Glenesk distillery lies on the banks of the river North Esk, which in my eyes is the true Esk, as it dramatically runs from Glenesk in the north down to the North Sea. Now, the distillery itself was mothballed in 1985, and now it only operates as maltings.
Well, surely though, if your whiskey was as good as you claimed it to be, then the distillery would still be going strong.
Well, you know as well as I that many distilleries were mothballed for a multitude of reasons. Take for example the Bowmore. I mean, that shut down during the war, but the Japanese opened it up a few years ago and it's going as strong as ever now.
I guess that's true, Ron. Well, I think I've met my match in you, Ron McCulloch. Normally when I have guests on this show, I get to look down on their inferior whisky knowledge and their general stupidity. But not you, my friend. You seem to know your stuff. Well, it's been a pleasure meeting you, Ron. As always, I like to meet a man who understands the pleasure and enjoyment that only a dram of whisky can produce.
Well, thank you very much for having me on the show. It's been an absolute pleasure. Take care of yourself, George.
Pleasure's mine. Oh, and Ron, good luck with those views of yours. Now, I'm afraid that's the end of the show. I hope you've enjoyed watching it as much as I've enjoyed presenting it. Next week, we're up to Speyside, which is considered by most as the true heartland of Scotch whiskies. Home to many of the finest single malts in the world, including Glenfiddich, the world's best-selling single malt, Glenlivet, and a host of lesser-known but nonetheless spectacular single malts. See you next week. Good night.